I went to the farm because I needed work after my second DUI made factory jobs dry up. My license was gone. The plants in town did not want someone who could not pass insurance checks. My uncle knew a man outside Fort Dodge who needed help repairing fencing and hauling feed. Paid cash by the week. I told myself it would be temporary, long enough to get back on my feet. The farm sat miles from the nearest paved road. The gravel ended and the fields took over. Corn on every side, flat and tight, rose straight enough to make the land feel measured and watched. Sound carried too far. A gate clank or a cough seemed to slide across the fields and come back thin and late. I could hear the wind run through the leaves and then stop all at once, like a switch. I stayed in a trailer on the edge of the property. It was old, thin-walled, set on blocks, with a small porch that sagged on one corner. Inside smelled of dust and old cooking oil. The power worked. The water worked most days. At night, the trailer felt exposed, like it had been placed there for a reason and then forgotten. The pigs were aggressive in a way I had not seen before. I had been around hogs as a kid. These were different. They watched instead of reacting. When I walked past the pens, they did not rush the fence or squeal. They stood still, heads angled, eyes locked on me, tracking each step. Their breathing was loud and fast, wet and steady, as if they were waiting for a signal. When I turned my back, I could feel the shift behind me, the scrape of hooves, the weight of bodies leaning forward. The owner rarely came out during the day. I saw him most mornings before sunrise, moving between buildings with a headlamp, finishing things before light. He kept the barns closed tight even when the heat climbed. The gates stayed chained. The work he gave me was simple and heavy. Fix fence lines along the west field. Haul feed sacks from the shed to the pens. Clear brush along the tree line. He paid on time. He did not linger. Most of the activity happened before sunrise. I learned that fast. I would wake to the hum of machinery and then silence. When I stepped outside later, the air would hold a smell that did not fit the animals. Not rot, not manure. Something metallic, thin, like old pennies warmed by skin. It hung low near the barns and faded as the sun came up. I started noticing deep impressions in the mud between the hog pens and the tree line. The ground there stayed soft because of runoff and shade. The marks were longer than boots and spaced too far apart. They cut deep at the front and dragged at the back. They did not match tires or equipment. I tried to place my own steps beside them and could not. The stride was wrong. The weight was wrong. Some mornings the pigs would be silent. Not calm, silent, pressed against the far side of the pens, bodies packed, breathing fast. Their eyes stayed fixed on the corner near the trees. The fence between us would shiver under their weight. When a sound came from the tree line, small and dry, they flinched as one and then froze again. I told myself there were explanations. Wild hogs crossed through. Deer cut the mud. Machinery tracks blurred by rain. I needed the work. The cash mattered. I stayed. The far barn sat beyond the pens, closer to the trees. It had no windows on the north side and the door hung uneven, swollen at the bottom. I was told not to go in there. The instruction was casual, tossed out once and never repeated. I kept my distance until one night I followed the noise. It started as a thud that carried through the ground, not loud but heavy. Then a scrape. Then a low rush of air like breath forced through a narrow space. I waited, listening. The sound came again, closer to the barn. I took a flashlight and walked out. The path cut through packed dirt and then mud. The moon was low. The corn whispered without wind. When I reached the far barn, the door was open. The smell inside was wrong. Metallic, not animal. Caught in my throat. The beam of my light slid across the floor and stopped. The concrete was stained in wide arcs. Not spills. Swings. The marks overlapped and dried in layers. Along one wall lay lengths of chain and a set of heavy hooks bolted into beams. The hooks were worn smooth where something had rubbed against them again and again. There were marks on the walls at shoulder height, scraped raw. No carcasses. No tools laid out like a shop. Just space, stains, and the sense of work done fast and often. I backed out and closed the door as it was. I did not sleep much after that. Each night brought the same pattern. Early movement, then silence. The pigs breathing hard. The smell fading with the light. I later learned the previous farmhand left suddenly and never came back for his truck. It sat near the machine shed, dust thick on the hood, tires half sunk. I noticed it when I hauled feed past it one afternoon. The cab was empty. The bed held a few tools, rusting where rain had found them. No plates. The owner did not mention it. I asked around in town without making it a thing. The answer came back thin and final. The sheriff had checked and been told the man moved on. No report, no follow-up. To fit the area, people left. Work was hard. Cash dried up. The impressions in the mud grew clearer after rain. They came and went on a schedule that matched the early hours. One morning I found one track pressed over another, as if whatever made it had turned sharply underweight. The edge of the print cut clean, showing a shape that was not round or split like a hoof. It looked like a foot that had learned to carry more than it should. I started locking the trailer at night. The lock was cheap. It made a sound that felt too small. I wedged a chair under the knob and kept the light off. From the bed I could hear movement across the field, a steady pace that did not hurry. When it stopped, the quiet pressed in until my ears rang. The last week broke something open. The owner stayed away for 2 days. The work piled up. The pigs grew restless. On the third night, the noise came earlier and did not stop. It moved from the far barn toward the pens and back again, repeating. The pigs slammed the fence and then fell silent, pressed tight, eyes wide. I stayed inside until the power cut. The trailer went dark. The hum died. Outside, the steps came closer, slow and sure, circling. The floor flexed with each pass. The smell slid under the door, thin and metallic. I sat still and counted breaths until the sound moved off toward the trees. At first light I packed. I did not check the barn. I did not look at the pens. I drove past the truck and stopped. The door on the driver's side was open. Inside, the seat was torn at the edge, foam exposed. There were dark stains on the floor mat that had soaked deep. In the bed, under a tarp, lay a set of boots, crushed at the toes, leather split and folded wrong, like they had been twisted under weight. I quit 3 weeks after I arrived. I left without collecting the last pay. The owner did not come out. The truck was still there when I drove away. Months later, I read about a quiet investigation that went nowhere. A tip about missing livestock that did not match records. An inspection that found nothing actionable. No charges. No names. The farm kept operating. I do not think about monsters when I think about that place. I think about methods, about animals trained by fear and reward, about a man who worked before sunrise and kept chains where no one could see, about a previous hand who left his truck because he did not leave on his own terms. The impressions in the mud were not a mystery once I stopped pretending. They were proof of weight, practice, and time. I went back to my uncle's farm after 10 years away because he had a stroke and no one else wanted to deal with the place. The farm sat at the edge of a rural county road, surrounded by flat fields that stretched until they met a line of cottonwood trees and a drainage canal. I grew up there and knew every fence post, every low spot where water pooled after rain, every barn board that bowed in summer heat. Being gone had not changed the smell of dry soil mixed with manure and old oil. It had not changed the way the wind moved across the fields at night, steady and low, carrying sound farther than it should. The first week back felt heavy but normal. I cleaned the house, fixed a broken gate, and checked the livestock that remained. Most of the cattle had been sold off years earlier. What was left were a few aging cows, some pigs, and the chickens. The farm was no longer profitable. It existed because my uncle refused to leave it. The days passed with routine work, and the nights were quiet in a way that made sleep shallow. The house creaked as it always had. Mice moved inside the walls. None of that bothered me. What started to bother me was the cornfield on the east side of the property. That field had been abandoned for at least 3 seasons. The soil there was poor, and my uncle stopped planting it. Weeds had taken over, thick and waist-high. From the house, the field looked uneven, like something had pressed paths into it. I assumed deer or feral hogs had made their way through. That area was known for both. On the third morning, I walked the fence line and noticed several posts leaning inward. Not broken, just shifted. The wire was still tight. It looked like pressure had been applied slowly over time, not all at once. I followed the line toward the trees and found the ground churned in long strips. The marks were not random. They ran parallel, evenly spaced, like something heavy had been dragged back and forth. I could not place it. No equipment I knew would leave tracks like that without tearing deeper. I told myself it was erosion combined with animal movement and kept working. At night, I began hearing movement from that side of the farm. It was not loud. It sounded like steady activity, the kind of noise you hear when someone is working without urgency. Dirt shifting, plants bending. It carried on the wind and faded when the wind shifted. I would lie awake and listen until it stopped. I never heard engines or voices, just work sounds. A week in, I went out at first light to check the pigs. On the way back, I noticed one of the chickens missing. Then another. No feathers scattered. No sign of a struggle. The coop wire was intact. The latch had been lifted and set back in place. I assumed a raccoon at first, but raccoons tear. They do not leave things neat. That afternoon, I walked into the cornfield to look closer at the tracks. Inside, the air felt still. The weeds blocked the wind. The paths were clearer from within. They formed a grid. At several intersections, the ground had been dug out in shallow pits. Each pit was about the length of a person and not very deep. The soil had been piled neatly beside them. I knelt and touched the dirt. It was dry on top and damp underneath, like it had been turned recently. I left the field uneasy and tried not to think about it. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of metal scraping lightly. It came from the direction of the equipment shed. I stayed still and listened. The sound repeated, slow and deliberate. I waited for it to stop. It did not. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut across the yard. Everything looked the same. The shed door was closed. The scraping stopped the moment the light touched it. I stood there longer than I should have, feeling watched without seeing anything. Eventually, I went back inside. The next morning, the shed door stood open. Inside, a shovel leaned against the wall that had not been there before. It was one of mine, but it was clean. Too clean. The blade showed fresh scratches, the kind made by rocky soil. The handle was dry, no dew, even though everything else was damp. I closed the shed and locked it. Over the following days, more small things changed. Feed buckets moved. A fence latch unhooked and rehooked. One of the pigs disappeared without sound or trace. The remaining animals grew restless, pacing, refusing to sleep near the fence closest to the cornfield. I considered calling the sheriff, but I had nothing solid to report. No damage. No theft that could be proven. Just a feeling that someone was using the farm while I slept. I decided to stay awake one night and watch. I turned off the house lights and sat on the porch after midnight. The moon was thin. The field lay dark and still. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the sound began again, faint at first, then clearer. Soil being moved. A steady rhythm. I watched the edge of the field and saw shapes shifting low to the ground. Not animals. The movement was too controlled. A figure emerged into the open, pushing a wheelbarrow. The person wore dark clothing and moved with practiced ease, stopping only to adjust the load. They crossed a strip of moonlight, and I saw their face for a moment. It was someone I recognized from childhood. A man who used to work neighboring land before he lost his own farm. He had stayed in the area, doing odd jobs, sleeping where he could. People said he was harmless, just broken by debt and time. I stayed still. He moved back into the field and continued working. At dawn, I walked out there. Several of the shallow pits were now filled. The soil packed flat. At one spot, the earth sank slightly under my weight. I dug with my hands until I uncovered fabric. Under it was the stiff shape of a chicken, wrapped tight and buried shallow. I kept digging and found another pit like it. Then another. Each held a dead animal from my farm. I understood then. He was storing food, using my land because he knew it and knew no one would come looking. The grid made sense now. Easy access, even spacing. The work sounds were preparation, not hiding. I called the sheriff and showed them everything. They found him sleeping in the trees with tools and stolen supplies. He did not resist. They explained later that he had been living like that for months, moving from place to place, burying food to survive. After that, the farm felt empty again, but the feeling did not leave. The soil still showed faint lines where he worked. The animals never returned to that side of the land. I finished what I came to do and sold the property. I still think about how close I was to sleeping through all of it, how easily the land hid someone working every night, steady and patient, just beyond the reach of the house lights. We went because it was cheap. That was the whole reason. None of us had money, and the semester had been long. A friend of my cousin knew someone whose grandparents owned a stretch of farmland near the hills. The land was no longer registered for regular use, but locals still planted parts of it. Nobody lived there full-time. We were told we could camp there as long as we stayed out of the way. It sounded empty and quiet, and we wanted empty and quiet. The drive out took us off paved roads and onto packed dirt that cut through fields of wheat and corn. The hills rose low and dark in the distance. The farmhouse sat back from the road, slumped and leaning, its roof broken in on one side. The windows were empty holes. A rusted tractor stood half sunk into the soil beside a collapsed fence. Everything smelled of dust, old plants, and sun-baked metal. During the day, it felt harmless. The fields stretched far, broken by narrow paths where people had walked or driven small equipment. There were no power lines close by, no signs. The quiet felt wide and open. We set up tents near a dry irrigation ditch, far enough from the farmhouse to avoid debris. We drank and laughed and treated the place like a borrowed secret. What I noticed first was that nobody stayed once the light dropped. During the afternoon, we saw locals working small plots. Older men mostly, using hand tools and small machines. They never came near the farmhouse. As the sun lowered, they packed up fast. Vehicles left in a steady line. By the time the sky went orange, the land was empty except for us. That pattern repeated each day. No one stayed late. No one returned after dark. The first night, the fields sounded different. The wind moved through the crops in a steady way, but there was another movement that did not match it. Long, narrow sounds passed through the plants, not crashing or rushing. The crops bent in straight lines, like something moving with purpose. It did not circle. It did not stop. It traveled the rows in clean paths. Dogs started howling from the villages beyond the hills. The sound rose together, spread, then cut off at the same moment. It was not random barking, felt timed. The silence afterward felt pressed and tight. I stayed awake longer than I wanted to. I watched the dark lines move through the field by the way the crops leaned and lifted. I told myself it was wind passing through rows cut at different angles. I believed it because I needed to sleep. The second day, we explored more. Behind a long tin shed near the farmhouse, we found the scarecrows. They were not standing in fields. They were tied together with wire and rope, stacked in a loose pile like stored tools. Old clothes hung stiff with dirt. Some had wooden cross frames, others had metal rods. The heads were sacks or plastic containers. None of them were new. The way they were tied felt careful, not abandoned, stored. The shed itself had marks on the ground leading away from it. Narrow grooves in the dirt, straight and even. They ran toward the fields, then vanished where the soil hardened. That night, the movement returned. The same long paths through the crops. The dogs howled again, same time, same length. I checked my phone clock. The timing matched the night before within minutes. The air felt colder even though the temperature had not dropped much. The field no longer felt empty. It felt watched without any sense of eyes. On the third night, one of my friends wandered toward the barn. The barn sat farther out, half fallen, its roof sagging. He came back pale and shaking. His hands would not stay still. He kept looking toward the fields. He did not eat. He He did not drink. He packed his bag in silence and sat close to his car. Whatever he saw changed the way the space felt. The field no longer held curiosity. It held pressure. I watched the rows near the barn as the dark settled. A tall shape stood between them. It did not move. It was closer than it should have been to where my friend had gone. It was too straight for a person standing at rest, too narrow for equipment. It blended into the crops except for the way it blocked the stars behind it. I could not tell how long it had been there. The dogs howled again. The shape was gone when the sound ended. We left before sunrise. We did not take time to clean the site. The farmhouse loomed as we passed it, empty and broken. On the dirt road out, I noticed fresh furrows behind us. 2 parallel grooves, even and deep, running the length of the road. They were not tire tracks. They were dragged, steady, deliberate. I did not understand what I had seen until later. Weeks after, I searched records and spoke to people who knew the area. The land had been used for years by cooperative farmers who rotated fields at night to avoid heat damage. They used an old crop-walking rig built decades ago. It was tall, narrow, and designed to move through rows without breaking them. It could be fitted with dragging tools to level soil and clear pests. It was pulled by a cable system anchored beyond the fields, not by an engine. Silent except for the crops moving. The dogs reacted to a high-pitched control whistle used to signal the rig's movement. 1 blast to start, 1 to stop. It traveled the same schedule each night to avoid overlap with workers. The scarecrows were not decoration. They were weighted guides, tied together and dragged behind the rig to flatten growth evenly and scare animals ahead of the path. They were stored behind the shed when not in use. The tall shape was the rig itself, paused between rows when the cable tension shifted. It stood higher than a person and did not sway. From a distance, it looked wrong because it was not meant to be seen close. The furrows on the road were from the guides being dragged back to storage before morning, crossing the dirt where the soil stayed soft. We were not supposed to be there. The locals never stayed after dusk because the equipment ran blind through the fields, controlled from far off. The farmhouse was left standing as a warning, not a shelter. Nothing supernatural happened to us. We walked into a system we did not understand. The fear came from being near something built to move without noticing people, something that did not need to look alive to cause harm. I do not camp on farmland anymore, not because I believe in things hiding in the dark, but because I know how quiet human work can be when it is meant to go unseen. I inherited the farm when my father died. The paperwork arrived before the ground thawed. I had not been back since I was a teenager, and even then I had avoided most of it. My father worked it until his knees failed, then rented the fields out while keeping the house and sheds locked. When he passed, the land came to me in pieces, every acre accounted for, every rusted machine listed. I did not stay out of attachment. I stayed because the equipment still had value and the property taxes did not pause for grief. The house stood where I remembered it, low and square, paint burned thin by years of sun. The fields were productive, planted in wheat that moved in wide sheets when the wind crossed the hills. The outbuildings had sagged. The machine shed leaned toward the east. The barn roof dipped at the ridge. Doors hung crooked on their hinges. Nothing had collapsed fully, but everything felt one hard winter away from it. I slept in the house and worked from first light until dusk. I cataloged equipment, drained fluids, tagged what could be sold. I fixed fences where cattle had once pressed through. The days were ordinary. The nights were not. Every evening, the wind rose at the same time, came down from the hills and slid across the wheat in consistent lanes. I noticed it because it did not scatter. It flowed. Long channels opened in the crop, always angled toward the same low point near the center of the south field. That low point held an old well that had been filled decades earlier, capped with a round slab of concrete. I remembered my father pouring it himself after a calf fell in and broke a leg. He had filled it with stone, then sealed it. The ground there still dipped slightly, a shallow bowl that caught runoff. At first I thought the wind followed the land. The field sloped that way. It made sense. What did not make sense was the consistency. Even on nights when the breeze shifted, the lanes returned to that same point. The wheat bent and lifted like it was being guided. I began finding bones near the well, small at first, ribs and leg pieces bleached by sun. I told myself coyotes dragged them there. They had always worked the edges of the fields. What bothered me was the arrangement. The bones lay in loose arcs, not scattered. Skulls faced inward. It looked less like feeding and more like placement. The well cap had been disturbed. Dirt piled against one side. A corner of the slab showed where soil had been pushed away. I checked it with a shovel. The concrete was intact. The stone fill beneath had not shifted. Something had dug at the edge, then stopped. The nights grew heavier as the work progressed. I started noticing movement before the wind reached me. The wheat would part slightly ahead of something traveling through it. Not crashing, not running. The plants leaned away, then closed again. The motion stayed low, close to the ground, and followed the same lanes each night. One evening, while repairing a fence along the south field, I saw it clearly. The sun was still up. The air was calm. The wheat parted in a narrow line 30 yards out. The heads bent forward, then spread. The movement passed through without breaking stalks. I stood still and watched until the line reached the shallow bowl around the well. The wheat there lay flatter than elsewhere, pressed by years of runoff and foot traffic. The movement disappeared into that depression. I stayed inside after that. From the kitchen window, I watched the fields at night. The lanes formed again and again, sometimes more than one. They converged at the same point. I heard digging once, faint and steady. I did not go out. I finished my work faster. I sold what I could and arranged pickup. Before I left, I sealed the well again. I hired a local crew to pour fresh concrete over the old cap, thicker this time, keyed into the surrounding soil. Cost more than I wanted to spend, but I did it anyway. I watched the pour set and felt a weight lift that I had not named. The next season, the wheat grew unevenly. The area around the well stayed shorter and darker. Water pooled there after rain and drained slower than before. The lanes still formed in the wind, but they broke apart near the center, confused by the change in grade. I learned later what had been moving through the field. Badgers had moved into the old stone fill, using gaps beneath the cap where the soil had settled. They traveled the same paths each night, creatures of habit, carving lanes through the wheat that bent without breaking. Coyotes followed them, waiting for rodents flushed by the digging. They cached bones near the den, arranging them unconsciously as they returned again and again to the same place. The well had never been fully sealed. Stone shifts over time. Animals find weakness. The wind followed the paths worn by repeated movement, exaggerating them until they looked deliberate. Nothing supernatural lived there, only animals using land shaped by human work and neglect. The fear came from seeing order where I did not expect it, from realizing how easily life adapts to forgotten spaces. I sold the farm that winter. I disclosed the well and the concrete. The new owner planted a different crop and graded the low point. The lanes never returned. I still remember the way the wheat parted before I understood it, and how silence can feel like intention when you are alone long enough to notice patterns forming around you. We bought the property because we wanted out of the city. That was the simple truth. Noise, traffic, rent, neighbors stacked on top of us. The listing showed open land, a modest barn, and a house that needed work but stood solid. The price was low because it had history. I did not ask what kind. I assumed it meant old fences, old owners, old repairs layered over each other. I thought history was something you could paint over. The first weeks were calm. The land rolled gently toward a tree line on the north side. Past that, the ground dropped into unmanaged woods that stretched farther than the property map suggested. We bought goats because the pasture suited them and because we wanted something alive to care for. During the day, they grazed without issue. They followed the sun, chewed slowly, and rested near the barn when it grew hot. Nothing felt wrong while the light was up. At night, they changed. As dusk settled, they gathered close to the barn walls. Not near the door, Along the boards themselves, pressed tight, their bodies touched. They did not wander. They did not spread out to rest. When darkness fully set in, they shifted and stamped, hooves scraping wood. Some nights they cried until their throats went rough. It was not hunger or cold. It was panic without direction. I checked fencing again and again. No gaps, no loose posts. The barn doors closed clean. I added extra latches. I told myself animals take time to adjust. We installed trail cameras along the fence line and near the trees. I wanted proof of whatever was stirring them. The cameras worked during the day. Clear images of goats, birds, wind, moving grass. At night, between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., they failed. Not every night, but often enough to notice a pattern. The files from that hour corrupted. Still images tore into blocks. Videos cut short. Batteries drained fast, sometimes dying in a single night when they should have lasted weeks. I replaced batteries. I changed memory cards. I moved cameras. The failures followed the same window. I began finding hair caught in the fencing. Long strands, coarse and stiff. Not like goat hair, which pulls easy and curls slightly. Not like deer, which is hollow and brittle. These strands were thick, almost wire-like, dark with lighter tips. They snagged low near the bottom wires, stretched as if pulled hard. I gathered some and sealed them in a bag. I told myself it was from livestock that had been there before we arrived. Old signs coming loose. One morning, we found a goat dead. It lay just outside the barn, body intact except for the neck and abdomen. The cuts were clean, no tearing, no scattered remains, no sign of struggle in the dirt. It had not been dragged. It had been killed where it stood. The rest of the body had been left untouched. No scavengers had worked it. The eyes were open. The ground beneath showed pressed grass, but no chaos. Predators usually eat fast and messy. They pull. They scatter. This felt deliberate. We buried the goat far from the tree line. The remaining animals refused to graze that corner of the pasture afterward. They angled their bodies away from it, even when fresh growth pushed through. The neighbors noticed before we said anything. They watched the goats from across their fence. They saw the way the herd shifted as a group when the sun dropped. They told us to reinforce the barn and avoid the tree line. They did not explain further. Their advice came with the flat tone of people repeating something learned the hard way. I reinforced the barn. I added heavy mesh behind the boards. I sank extra posts. I sealed gaps with metal flashing. I installed motion lights facing outward. The lights triggered at night without showing anything in the beams. Just empty grass, swaying branches, drifting insects. The goats still panicked. They pushed against the walls hard enough to bruise themselves. The cameras failed again. Same hour, same corruption. When I checked the timestamps, I noticed something else. The internal clocks drifted. Some jumped forward by minutes. Some froze entirely. Electronics can fail in cold or moisture, but the nights were mild and dry. I walked the fence line during the day and found more hair. I also found impressions in the soil that did not match hoof or paw cleanly. Long pressure marks where weight had been distributed across narrow points. Not claws, not hooves, something that leaned and shifted as it moved. I stopped sleeping well. Between 2 and 3 in the morning, I woke every night without an alarm. The goats would already be restless. The air felt tight. The woods at the edge of the property held sound differently at that hour. The insects went quiet. The wind slowed. The tree line looked closer than it did during the day. One night, I stood on the porch and watched the pasture. The motion lights stayed dark. The goats pressed together, bodies rigid. The grass along the fence near the trees bent inward, then settled. Bent again. It was subtle, like something passing low and slow, careful not to break stalks. The movement stopped just short of the barn. I went inside and locked the door. We sold the place within 6 months. Before closing, I did my own research. The history mentioned in the listing referred to a failed fur operation decades earlier. Large animals, bred for pelts, kept in enclosures near the tree line. Records showed repeated escapes. Traps had been set and reset. Over time, the operation shut down, but not all animals were accounted for. The woods beyond the property were never cleared. Generations passed. Descendants adapted. What had been moving through our land was not mythical. It was feral, large, and careful, no longer afraid of fencing, smart enough to avoid lights, strong enough to pull hair free without tearing wire. The camera failures were caused by repeated interference from motion triggers and pressure against housings, draining batteries fast and corrupting files mid-write. The clean kill was the result of a practice predator that fed selectively and returned to cover before scavengers could arrive. The neighbors knew because they had learned to live around it. Reinforce. Avoid the trees. Do not keep vulnerable animals near the edge. We left because adapting meant accepting the risk. The land was not empty. It was occupied by something shaped by human use and abandonment, something that had learned the schedule of night and the limits of our tools. The city feels loud now, but it feels safe. When I hear goats cry in videos online, my chest tightens. I remember the way they pressed into the barn walls, not trying to escape, only trying to put something solid between themselves and the dark. I was hired seasonally to help with shearing because I needed work and the pay was better than town jobs. The farm sat between two long hills where the land dipped inward, forming a shallow bowl. Sound behaved oddly there. Wind did not travel straight. Machinery noise came back a second later, softer, as if the hills held it and returned it altered. The remoteness appealed to me at first. I thought quiet would make the weeks pass faster. The owner showed me the boundaries on the first day. Pastures rolled outward, broken by rock shelves and sudden drops where the limestone gave way. He warned me not to wander at night. He said the ground could open without warning and that cliffs hid behind grass that looked solid until it was not. I took the warning seriously but assumed it was routine caution meant for people unfamiliar with the land. The sheep moved in wide groups, steady and predictable. During the day they grazed calmly, spreading out along the slopes. At times they stopped as one, heads lifted, bodies locked, their gaze always fixed on the same hill to the west. The hill rose higher than the others and held a bare stretch near the top where grass thinned to stone. When the sheep stared, they did not bleat or shift. They simply watched. The first time I noticed it, I followed their line of sight and saw a tall silhouette against the skyline. It stood upright and narrow. From that distance, it looked like a fence post or a marker. I did not think much of it. Farms collect debris. Old structures linger longer than they should. Later that day, the sheep moved again, as if released. The hill returned to its empty shape. The work was hard but routine. Shearing days blurred together. The quarters where I slept sat apart from the main house, a long, low building that smelled of wool and oil. The nights were darker than I was used to. No nearby roads, no passing lights. When the wind died, the quiet felt heavy enough to press against my ears. On the third night, I stepped outside before bed. The sheep were gathered closer than usual, clustered near the lower fences. The hill loomed dark against a sky washed thin with stars. I looked for the silhouette without knowing why. It was there again, same shape, same height. I stared long enough for my eyes to adjust, tracing its edges. It did not move. It felt wrong in the way something mechanical feels when it appears where it should not. I went inside and slept poorly. Over the next week, the sightings continued. Always at dusk or early night. Always on that hill. Once, when clouds cut the sky low, I lost sight of it and felt relief that surprised me. Another evening, I checked again and it was closer. Not by much, but enough to change how it sat against the slope. The sheep had stopped grazing and watched it without sound. I told myself perspective had shifted. Light plays tricks. Distance lies. I avoided the hill as instructed. I stayed within the known paths during daylight. Still, the sense of being watched grew. It was not constant. It came in waves, strongest when the sheep froze and the wind bent around the hills in odd loops. In the shearer's quarters, I found old journals stacked in a crate beneath a broken table. They belonged to past workers. The entries were practical at first. Counts, weather notes, small complaints. Then patterns emerged. mentions of the hill, descriptions of a tall shape seen at a distance, notes about leaving early due to unease or sudden illness. No one wrote about being chased or threatened. They simply stopped writing mid-season. The dates stretched back decades. One entry described the land settling at night. Small tremors felt through the ground. Another mentioned a survey team that worked the Western Hill years before, drilling cores and leaving equipment when funding ran out. The equipment was tall, narrow, and mounted on tracks. It had been moved and repositioned during the survey, then abandoned when the company dissolved. I searched old records online when I had signal. The geology of the area showed unstable limestone riddled with voids. Sinkholes formed slowly, then collapsed without warning. Survey rigs had been used to map underground cavities. Some were never recovered. The silhouette matched the shape of a mobile drilling mast. The realization did not bring comfort. It made things worse. If the rig remained out there, it meant the ground beneath it was unstable. It meant the hill was not fixed. It shifted. The sheep sensed vibrations through their hooves long before I could feel them. They stared because something moved beneath the surface, changing pressure in ways animals understand and people ignore. One evening, I saw the silhouette again, closer still. The angle suggested it had shifted downhill. The sheep huddled tight, pressing into each other. The ground underfoot felt firm, but I remembered the journals and the warnings. The rig did not walk. It slid as earth gave way beneath it, inch by inch, silent. That night, I felt a low vibration through the floor of the quarters. It was faint, steady, like distant machinery heard through layers of earth. I did not go outside. I packed my bag instead. Before dawn, I loaded my car. I left my gear behind. I left my pay uncollected. I did not leave a note. The road out cut between rock faces that loomed pale in early light. As I drove, I glanced back once. The hill looked unchanged. The silhouette was gone. Weeks later, I learned from a news brief that a section of land near the farm had collapsed, revealing a deep cavity and the remains of old survey equipment twisted and buried. No injuries were reported. No livestock lost. No one called to ask why I left. Seasonal workers came and went there often. People did not disappear. They just left suddenly when they sensed the land shifting under rules they could not control. I still think about the way the sheep watched the hill, calm and certain, responding to changes too subtle for me to feel until it was almost too late.